continuing to do a lot of traveling, and I was actually abducted this last week. I was in the metropolitan Minneapolis airport, and I went to catch a cab. And when I went into the cab, I only had to go 3 miles. And the cab driver, who apparently had been waiting for some time for a long ride, got very distressed. And he got angry and started yelling. And then this is when I was already in the cab, so he got out of the cab and locked the door so I couldn't get out. And then he walked away and left me in the cab. So after 10 minutes, he came back. And then he drove me around a very circuitous route and took me to the hotel and charged me $17. He wouldn't let me out of the cab.
So the meter was running, I guess. Huh?
Yes, it was.
$70?
So I'm back safely. Unfortunately, while I was in the cab, I just focused on my breath and figured that there was enough oxygen in the cab to last me. And when I got to the hotel, I figured that it was best not to argue because you don't know what kind of mind state people are in. So I paid them and was relieved. And when I went into the hotel and told them that I had had a little bit of an adventure, they took pity on me and they put me in the nice room. So I'm not happy to be here. So these little adventures take place. But it always is a test, of how it is that you want to look at things. And how we look at things really is our view. And very important not to attach to your view too strongly. Particularly as a layperson, it's difficult not to have any views. But if you do have a view, at least be able to say this is a view and not to attach to it too strongly. So I'm going to share with you some non-view views today. And the first one is going to be called the twofold truth. As Dharma teachers, we aspire to communicate the Dharma without being attached to conceptual dogmas or doctrine. This is very important. Very important as a Dharma teacher not to espouse some kind of doctrine or dogma or a set of views. When you espouse a dogma or a doctrine or a set of views, you are always going to get an opposite reaction of a person who has a different point of view than yours. So this usually will lead to an argument or conflict. So in Buddhism there is a logic that's used where we encourage each person to seek their own experience. The Kalama Sutta was referenced last time, where the Buddha says we should not believe teachers or traditions, we should only believe our own experience. So it's very important to recognize that other people are like this too. They attach to things, but ultimately they're going to believe their own experience. And this is the reason that we use what's called a negative method of assertion in Buddhism. Rather, this should not be confused with an assertion of a negative. For example, we have the 3 Dharma seals, or the 4 Dharma seals, depending upon whether we're looking at the original teachings or the Mahayana teachings. You'll notice that I do not use the term Hinayana. And the reason that I don't use the term Hinayana, which means small boat, instead I use the term original schools, is because there are some people who have tried to compare Mahayana to the original schools by saying that one is superior to the other. So as soon as you start using the term superior, now you're attaching to a view. So it's good not to get stuck in that kind of discussion, but to honor each one of the traditions in Buddhism and not to attach to one or the other. So, Ichi Sin Wuchana. This is all composed phenomenon are impermanent. All conditioned phenomenon are unsatisfactory. All conditioned phenomenon are without a self. These are the three marks that you'll notice about all of the Buddhist teachings. This is from the original schools. In Mahayana, they add a fourth seal, saying that there is such a thing called nirvana. Well, of course, the original school would say that that goes without saying, because that's the third noble truth. So there's no reason to make a big distinction between the three or the four Dharma seals. They're virtually synonymous. So we know that as we look at the world in this way, that this method of looking at the world is not a doctrine or a dogma. This is actually here to help us so that we don't attach to things as a dogma or a doctrine. So this is very important. You'll see that each thing is kind of asserting or non-asserting how things are in that way. So there is this teaching called the twofold truth. One of the difficulties that was emerging in India around the first century was the problem of so many of the original school followers being caught up in two different disputes. One dispute was just that people were arguing about how to interpret the Dharma, and they were going through many intellectual arguments to discuss why this view was the right view and that view wasn't the right view. There was a lot of discussion about this. The other dispute was whether or not the correct path was just to go off into the forest and leave humanity behind, seek your own enlightenment, and only after that return to the world. So, because most of the people were not going to get fully enlightened, many of the practitioners were going off into the forest and not coming back to the world. So this gave the impression to people that those practitioners of Buddhism didn't care about anybody else but themselves. They just wanted their own enlightenment. So because of these two conflicts that were happening, the great teacher Nagarjuna recognized that there needed to be a reformation in Buddhism. A reformation that first said, since there's no self that has to be enlightened in that way. So to go off into the world and to just focus on yourself is just a very selfish thing to do. So best that you practice, but also see that there's not such a big distinction between samsara, the cycle of birth and death, and nirvana, the liberation from all suffering. That those two things are interconnected with each other. And also, he wanted to put to rest many of the great intellectual debates of the time. So he developed a methodology of logic that really poked holes in much of the disputes that were going on in the different schools. As a result of this, what emerged was really that Nagarjuna was saying that there were two levels at which we can look at things. One is a relative conventional level. We know that we have this body, we have this mind, we have this community. These things are affirmed by our senses, so that the world that is created through our sense contact is called the conventional world. And in the conventional world, there are many conventional truths But then there is another world. This is the ultimate world. And our senses don't necessarily make contact with that world so much, because our senses are limited. Even our conceptual ability, when it's not trained at the higher level, can't see these other parts of the world. And so we can't see the absolute truth. We can't see what was called the suchness of reality. In the same way that our eyes cannot see that this table is jumping in and out of existence at a subatomic level, in the same way that our mind has a very difficult time perceiving this ultimate truth. So Nagarjuna was interested in helping us understand this, the difference between conventional truth and ultimate truth. And this went so far as to be able to help people understand that there was a conventional bodhicitta. A bodhicitta means the mind of a person who is awake, the awakened mind, at the relative level, focuses on being loving, kind, and compassionate. The ultimate bodhicitta mind is a mind that perceives and understands emptiness. Now, one of the bodhisattva vows is that we do not want to go into an explanation of emptiness with people who are not prepared or ready. The reason for this is that it would cause a lot of disturbance and distress. So as teachers, when we become aware of, we begin to have some awareness of emptiness, we have to be very careful who we talk about this with, because it causes a lot of misunderstanding. Emptiness, on the easiest level to understand it, is using the terminology that Thich Nhat Hanh likes to use, which is to say that emptiness is empty of our selfishness. So it is a sense of interconnectedness with all beings. So Thich Nhat Hanh says that if you're a poet, you can see that there's a cloud in this piece of paper. Because without clouds, there can be no rain. Without rain, there can be no trees. Without trees, there can be no paper. So inside of this paper is a cloud. So we can say that the cloud and the paper interbeat. They are interconnected with each other. So when we talk about emptiness, from the most available reference points that we have in our conventional reality, we can begin to understand that we are not disconnected from any experience that we have, that we're all interconnected. So as a Dharma teacher, as a Buddhist, on that level, no matter who we see, no matter who we come in contact with, that person, we are interconnected with them. They're not separate from us. They are, in fact, one way of looking at it is to see them as our dear relative. You just don't happen to remember which side of the family they're on. So, when you look at people in this way, then you have a sense that each person that you are looking at and experiencing, they have within them this capacity to become enlightened, to become a bodhisattva, or to become a great being. And so you're actually seeing that great being within them. My wife teaches kindergarten. And one of the things that she says is that whenever she looks at a kindergartner, she sees that person as a reader, even though they may not yet know how to read. So she knows that they have the capacity to be a reader. And so she relates to them as a reader. She doesn't say to them, oh, you don't know how to read. She says to them, oh, you have the ability to read, let's learn the letters and put them together, and you can form sounds, and very soon you'll be able to read. So in her class, almost all of the students are learning to read. They're able to read by the end of the first semester because they're all seen as readers. In the same way, we look at each person and recognize that they are, in a sense, a Buddha. So we see them in that way. With our Buddha eye, we're able to, whatever is cultivated there, so that we're able to see that they have that capacity. And so we see them in this way. So this is the difference between just being locked in the conventional world. If you're just locked in the conventional world, you don't see the ultimate world at all, then each person you see their traits. You're always saying, oh, they have this fault, they have that fault, they have this fault. And you constantly focus on their faults. And then you look at yourself and you say, oh, these people aren't going to like me because they're going to see my faults. So now you've constructed a world, people construct a world where everybody is at fault, everybody is to blame, everybody is ashamed. And so when this takes place in the mind, we are feeling disconnected from everyone. So as teachers, we want to aspire to look at everyone in the world as a family member, as a person who has the potential to become a great enlightened being. So we treat them in this way. This is quite different. So relative experience and the absolute is another way that this is described in Nagarjuna. There's this term called Madhyamaka. Madhyamaka is one of the main schools of Mahayana Buddhism. So there's the original schools, and then after Nagarjuna, or during Nagarjuna's time and afterwards, there are the Mahayana schools. For our purposes, we're interested mostly in Madhyamaka and Yogacara. So later I'll talk a little bit about Yogacara, but I want to first talk about Madhyamaka. Madhyamaka means middle way. So the Buddha often spoke about how Buddhism was middle way between eternalism and nihilism. So even in the earlier suttas where the Buddha talks about emptiness and no mind, he talks about this within the context that it's not nothingness, nor is it an eternalism. It's something in between. Now we have a trouble seeing what's in between because the mind wants to gravitate towards these extremes. So it's very difficult for the mind to find what's in between. One of the important texts that was written in the Mahayana schools was called the Lankavatara Sutra. When Bodhidharma brought Buddhism to China, and I don't know, because I missed some of the earlier talks, unfortunately. And Tracy, have you gotten to Bodhidharma yet? You're going to bring Bodhidharma into the picture? Can I say anything about Bodhidharma, or should I wait? Okay. So Bodhidharma was not the first person to bring Buddhism to China. There were other people who were giving talks on Buddhism. There was one particular person who was giving talks on Buddhism, and Bodhidharma actually, when he got to China, sought him out because he was interested in understanding what was already in China, and he was thinking, maybe this is a great teacher that I can affiliate myself with. This would be wonderful. So he went to see this person give a Dharma talk. And this person's Dharma talk was so flowery and so beautiful, so many beautiful words coming out of his mouth, that the legend had it that out of the sky, petals of flowers came down and came around all of the people in the group. But Bodhidharma noticed that this person's understanding was missing some very important things, and that his teaching was incomplete, even though he was very flowery. So afterwards, Bodhidharma went up to him privately and said, "Sir, I have a question for you." And he asked him some question about the Dharma, and the flowery speaker suddenly became very angry. He didn't like this question. So he took off his mala that was around him, the beads, and he threw it with such force that it hit Bodhidharma in his teeth and knocked out his two front teeth. Bodhidharma just swallowed his teeth. He didn't say anything and bowed and walked away. Thereafter, the Bodhidharma decided that maybe people were not ready for his teachings. So he went to a cave, sat in a cave, facing the western wall. It was a very dark cave, so the wall was black. So he sat facing the cave, facing the western wall. When I met my first teacher, and I went to his place, his residence, and I went into the living room. In the living room, the western wall in his apartment was painted black. I asked him, "I've never seen a black wall before." He said, "Because of Bodhidharma." I didn't understand what that meant then. Years went by, 9 years went by. The flowery speaker, he got older. One day he had a near-death experience. He got very sick. He realized that he was not going to live so long. His life energy was dissipating. He got very frightened because his knowledge of the Dharma was incomplete. So he became frightened about his passing that was coming about very soon. He thought to himself, "I have to find a real teacher. Is there possibly a real teacher, a realized being, a great Buddha in China?" So he went and asked lots of people. And one person said, "There is a man living in a cave up there. I heard something about him." So the flowery speaker went up the mountain and went to the cave entrance and tried to get Bodhidharma to teach him. When Bodhidharma turned around and looked at him, Bodhidharma smiled. Oh, this is very, very upsetting. So this flowery speaker, as the legend has it, took out his sword and cut off his arm and handed it to Bodhidharma and said, "I'm in terrible distress. You must teach me. Yeah, I'll even give you my arm. My mind is in total chaos." And Bodhidharma said something like to him, "Show me your mind and I will calm it." And the flowery speaker said, "I can't show you my mind." He says, "I've already calmed it." Something like this, right? You know it in Chinese probably, right? Yes. You want to do it in Chinese for us? You know the actual quote? Yes. Caddy's very good.
师父，请安我心，可把心取出来，密心不可得，我已未如安心矣。
Very good. I agree. You understand? Yes. Yes. Just pretty close? Okay. So, this is the story. So Bodhidharma, when he had come to China, he only brought with him one book. he didn't bring all the suttas and things like that, and he figured that many of them had already come to China or would come later. So he only brought one book with him. He brought with him the Lankavatara Sutra. So up until a few months ago, there was no English translation of the Lankavatara Sutra in English. We only had summary versions. There was a summary version that was done by D.T. Suzuki, but it really was not a word-by-word translation. But recently, there was a translation done by Red Pine on the Lankavatara Sutra. So Red Pine is friends with Dan Lusthouse, who is at Harvard. I mentioned him last time, the Yogacara scholar. So when I went to Seattle, Washington some months ago, it was after I had a chance to meet with, we had a person come to Maba who just found Maba out of the blue. And she was from Washington. She came here and she stayed at Maba for a few weeks, and then she went back to Washington State. So when I went to Washington to give a seminar, we had met, and I called her and we had dinner together, and I told her I wanted to meet Red Pine because he had just finished the Lankavatara Sutra. And she said, "Oh, that sounds like fun." So she hopped on a plane and flew to Seattle from Eastern Washington. We met, and she took me up to see Red Pine. So somehow or other, this person's karma and mine are a little bit linked because we can't get away from each other. She's here today. She came back to Maba just at the right time. So we got to meet Red Pine and Lankavatara Sutra. I think I have a picture of you and Red Pine together. So, in the Lankavatara Sutra, one of the underlying concepts is called the 5 dharmas and the 3 svabhavas. This is a complicated teaching, but basically it looks to understand how we see things. First, we have an appearance of something. Then, the mind wants to name it, this appearance. Then, the mind forms ideas about it, conceptualizations. This is usually about as far as the uninstructed worldling mind goes. The Buddha in the original teachings used the term uninstructed worldling and noble disciple. So those people who have not been practicing the Dharma or practicing any way of awareness, they're just caught up in the physical world. This is what the physical world is. I'm going to become happy by acquiring more and more stuff in the physical world. This is where my happiness will come from. Those people are caught up in appearances, names, and discrimination. Only when a person has an awareness that there's something more than that, then they begin to seek after right knowledge and want to understand the Dharma, the Four Noble Truths. And then as they practice further, they have an awareness of this ultimate reality, this suchness, the tathata. So, I gave the Chinese as well. So there are these 3 self-natures. The first, this means the idea that we have some kind of inherent existence. The first is Parikalpa. This is this imagined or illusion that we have that what it is that we're seeing is all there is. Now, certainly physicists would say what we're seeing is certainly not all there is. We're just seeing one sliver of visible light. We're not seeing all the other levels of reality. When people at this level, Parikalpa, they're just caught up in this illusion. And they have this conceptualized imagination that just comes up with ideas about what it is that's going on based on their own framework, their own views. So if they see things in a negative way, they superimpose or they impute what's negative onto their experience. They use what's called subjective discrimination. The second paratantra is when a person begins to have an awareness that things are interconnected, that there is a conditioning that takes place, and that these conditions are all interconnected, and that you can't separate one thing from another. They're all part of a linkage. They're all dependently coordinating with each other, interdependently coordinating with each other. This is Paratantra, awareness. We begin to see this. So we don't really have a deep understanding, we just have a beginning understanding that there is this interconnection with all things. And then we use a dependently arising kind of logic. We begin to try to see things from that point of view. Finally, we attain a higher level of awareness where we can actually see into the true nature of experience. This is a person who has attained a high level of awakening. So this is a deeper understanding. So they go by way of the dependent coordination of things. And then they can use the logic of suchness and thusness to make sense of the world. So this allows us to see this kind of absolute truth. It's based on the 12 links of dependent origination. Now, one of the things that's very important to understand about Nagarjuna is that he based his Madhyamaka on the principle that in order to attain enlightenment, we only need to practice dependent origination. Patika Samudpada is all we need to practice. Now, where would he have gotten such a notion as this? Because Nagarjuna knew that when the Buddha reached his own enlightenment, what was it that he was meditating on? He was meditating on the 12 links of dependent origination. And it was from the 12 links of dependent origination that emerged the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. So this is why Nagarjuna went in that direction. So, the 12 links. Those of us who are practicing to become Dharma teachers, it's good to become very familiar with the 12 links. And to know that it is very likely that most uninstructed worldlings are going to be aware of the 12 links from the point of view of craving and clinging. These are the two places where the mind gravitates. I mentioned this last time. So, your own experience with the 12 links is very important. One of the things that we can see is that the interconnection of the 12 links is very important. The link between craving, clinging, and becoming, for example, that sequence is a very important sequence. This is another conceptualization you can use. You can see the 12 links as kind of a circle. Notice that one of the things about the 12 links, and this is something that I hope to get some further clarification of, either through communication with Bhante Sirananda, perhaps, or Bhikkhu Bodhi. I would like to talk with them about this, is because for me a link is something that connects one thing to another thing. But when people are denoting the 12 links, they talk about the 12 links by saying it's craving, it's clinging, it's becoming. My way of looking at it is the link is between craving and clinging, between clinging and becoming, which means that there would only be 11 links. Except there is one more link in the suttas, one very important sutta on right view. The link is made, what is the cause of ignorance? The cause of ignorance are the taints. So these need to be included. If you include the taints, then you have 12 links again. This is an area that I shouldn't get too caught up in. So I'll send these slides to you so you can see how it is that there are the descriptions of craving and clinging. Craving has sensual pleasure, the craving for existence, the craving for non-existence. I think, what is the craving for non-existence? We run across this, particularly in people whose minds are not well developed, who begin to realize that they are on the verge of death. They crave non-existence. I don't want to live anymore. I want my life to be over. I don't want to be in this existence. That's a form of craving too. So those are the 3 types of craving. So there's clinging to sensual pleasure, clinging to views, clinging to rules and rituals, and to a doctrine of self. These are things that we as practitioners recognize, oh, it's very important to learn how not to attach to these things. Usually, we have to be very careful because sometimes we can become critical of someone who, the Tibetan Buddhists bow in one way, the Japanese Buddhists bow in another way, Chinese Buddhists bow in another way. Do you want to get into an argument about which way is the right way to bow? So be careful when we begin to identify ourselves as, oh, I'm a teacher from Baba, and this is how I do things. You may see somebody else do something their own way. Be careful. Don't attach to your way as being better than somebody else's way. It's just a way. So, my time is up, isn't it?
No, you have 10 more minutes.
Oh, I have more time? How much time do I have? 10 minutes? I have Advil to hand out now. Yes, please. Yes.
Craving for non-existence.
Oh, yes, please.
If you crave to get out of the samsara or the 3 realms, it's another type of craving.
Oh, yeah.
So that's a craving for non-existence also.
That's a very Mahayana view. Okay. You may need something stronger than Advil for this next part. So this is Nagarjuna. This is the 25th, the 27th chapter. This is the chapter that the Dalai Lama has been studying for the last 15 years or so. So this is it. It says, according to you, this self is that, but the appropriator is different. if it is not the appropriator, what is yourself? Having shown that there is no self other than the appropriator should be the self, but it is not yourself. Appropriating is not the self. It arises and ceases. How can one accept that? Future appropriating is the appropriator. See why you need Advil? Oxycodone. So you need something very strong. So this is Nagarjuna, and this is, the Dalai Lama has been trying to understand this for 15 years. Here it is, I gave you the Garfield translation, because J. Garfield's translation is very poetic, it's beautiful, it's really well done. This is not Lankavatara, this is the Nagarjuna text. Okay. So, Maha Madhyamaka Karika. So, I found the Sanskrit. So the Garfield word appropriator in the Sanskrit is upadana. Upadana is, in the 12 links, is clinging. Here it is. Upadana. See? Okay? Upadana, clinging. So he uses that word appropriator, but really the word is upadana. In the Chinese, I gave it to the Chinese because Caddy would have an enlightenment, which you saw that. Yes. Okay. Although there should, I think that somehow or other it didn't divide right. That last character should go over one more. Yes, okay. I apologize. All right. So there's this group of people in Oslo who have done a translation too. They call it that which is clung to. That's closer to clinging. That's probably more accurate. So really the idea is that there is no such thing as the self. There is just this thing called the clinger. That's all there is. The clinger is what's creating this self. Once you don't have the clinger, you don't have the self. So I was, did I tell you the story about the fish? My experience with the fish? I didn't talk about the fish. So I was in Long Island, and I was at this restaurant in Long Island, and they had this huge fish tank, like 1,200 gallons of saltwater fish tank, and beautiful fish swimming on an entire wall, probably as big as the wall behind me, full of these beautiful fish. And the restaurant was serving very beautiful food, most of it seafood. And I think the fish were having anxiety attacks. So at the end of my meal, like a vegetarian, I went up to the fish tank, and this one fish came over to the edge of the tank, and he starts looking at me. So I go to the other side, he follows me. Then I asked the waitress, "What's with this fish?" She says, "I don't know what you mean." So she went over to the fish tank. The fish didn't have anything to do with it, lady. Then some other guests who had been eating there went over to the fish tank. I saw the fish just ignored the people. I went back over to the fish tank, and immediately this fish came right over. We looked in each other's eyes. And I could see that he didn't want to be in this tank. And he was looking to me to help him out of the tank. So I went to the front desk of the restaurant, to the hotel. The restaurant was in the hotel. And I spoke to the people at the front desk. I said, "You have a very unhappy guest here." He said, "Oh, no, sir, what's the problem? What can we do to make things better?" I said, "No, it's not me, it's somebody else." They said, "Oh, no, what can we do? How can we help this person out? We don't want to have any unhappy guests." where they take courses in hotel hospitality. So I said, it's actually the fish in the fish tank. He wants out. He feels like he's in prison. And the fellow behind the desk looked at me and he says, we all feel that we're in prison. So, Xiankuan Rinpoche, he was one of the original 8 subjects in Davidson's fMRI studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison when they were looking at people's brains. And he wrote a book called The Joy of Living, and in the intro it says, perhaps the most staggering result today came in the study of a handful of meditation addicts that included Xiankuan Rinpoche. During a meditation on compassion, neural activity in the key center of the brain system for happiness jumped 700 to 800%. For ordinary subjects in the study, volunteers who had just begun to meditate, that same area increased in activity by a mere 10 to 15%. This is the left prefrontal lobe, the dorsolateral V10 area. So this is where happiness, we know that a person has high level of happiness when this part of the brain is activated. So the monks have very high levels of activation in that area of the brain. So, Rinpoche said in his book, brain activity seems due to a very special class of cells called neurons. Neurons are very social cells. They love to gossip. In some ways, they're like naughty school children, constantly passing notes and whispering to one another, except that the secret conversations are mainly about sensation, movement, solving problems, creating memories, and producing thoughts and emotions. Recognizing the activity of neurons wouldn't be very important in terms of suffering or happiness, except for a couple of important details. When neurons connect, they form a bond very much like old friendships. They get into the habit of passing the same sorts of messages back and forth, the way old friends tend to reinforce each other. In neuroscientific terms, this capacity to replace old neuronal connections with new ones is referred to as neuronal plasticity, neuroplasticity. The Tibetan term for this capacity is Leson Ruwa, which may be roughly translated into English as pliability. You can use either term and sound very smart. What it boils down to is that on a strictly cellular level, repeated experience can change the way the brain works. This is the why behind the how of the Buddhist teachings that deal with eliminating mental habits conducive to unhappiness. I think that this is a very good description of mental formations, the 4th of the 5 skandhas. So what do we want to do? We want to transform our mind away from selfishness and self-conceit and self-cherishing and the self-delusion that we exist on some kind of independent level. And as we do that, the mind doesn't become a vegetable. The mind begins to cultivate loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. Those things that we know about. So, for example, and I'll talk more about this next time in terms of the difference between the Arhat path and the Bodhisattva path, you'll notice that when the Bodhisattva recites the 4 immeasurables, what is it that he is focusing or she is focusing on? Focusing on loving kindness, on compassion, on altruistic joy, and on equanimity. So let's do this together and focus our minds in this way. May all, please say it with me if you would. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the altruistic joy which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity which is free from attachment, aversion, and ignorance. Thank you for your kindness.